So let's go ahead and get started. We apologize, we got started just a couple of minutes late. We were having some technical issues, but we are good to go. So with that, I want to welcome everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see several new folks that are here today. And we also know that there'll be some folks that will be joining us as we start the presentation. But I wanted to say welcome to our third semester of Civic Dialogues. We are happy to welcome many of you who are new and also returning. I'm Patty Robinson. I am the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons, and I am joined by Kimberly Rosenfeld, who is Chair of Communication Studies at Cerritos College. And we have a third person who is also part of our work here, and that's Jan Connell. She's not able to be here today, but we hope to see her next week. And then we are very, very excited and happy to have Keelan Koenig here today with 3CSN. So she is our person who is on the sidelines running our tech component. So just as a history, and I know some of you have heard this, but some of you haven't, we began the Civic Dialogue series in fall 2020 as part of an intersegmental partnership grant from Bringing Theory to Practice between the community college system and CSU. That particular grant involved COC, Cerritos, Cal State Dominguez Hills, and Cal State Northridge. We were able to receive a second grant there shortly thereafter. We've now added to our partnership not only the two original CSU campuses, but we've added CSU LA, and also not only the two original community colleges, but also Los Angeles City College. And so we are really happy to have you here today because this started, quite frankly, as a result of COVID. We had hoped, as part of our deliverable for the first grant, to have an online faculty, or excuse me, an in-person faculty development training. But when COVID hit, we had to shift this to online. And as that resulted, we decided, well, let's not just have one presentation, let's have several. And so now as we move into our third semester, we've had some amazing speakers from around the country who are involved with civic engagement, democratic learning. And so a lot of this, again, is falling with the emphasis on a crucible moment. And I always use that document because it is so important for people to take a look at. So with that, we also have this set up in two parts. Our first part is our presentation with our guest speaker. We encourage you to put questions in the chat, or certainly we will unmute you at one point where you'll be able to ask our speaker direct questions. And then also after the presentation, the first hour or a little after, Kimberly and I will be moving into the deep dive. And that's where those of you who would like to continue to meet with us, we will look at and reflect upon a lot of the things that our speaker has to say. As I like to mention, we have three guiding frameworks to advance the understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, and civic engagement, to promote the public good, to recognize civic community and democratic engagement as a high impact practice connected to guided pathways, and to also leverage participants' current knowledge to build capacity to innovate for local and global change. And with that, it is my sincere honor to welcome our second speaker for the series. And this is Elizabeth Clay Roy. And Elizabeth Clay Roy is representing Generation Citizen. I learned about Generation Citizen by reading a very, very interesting, important book that turned me on to Generation Citizen. And the more I started digging, the more I found out about this incredible organization. So I want to formally introduce Ms. Roy in just a moment here, but I want to first read her bio. Elizabeth Clay Roy is a lifelong learner and leader of civic engagement and social change initiatives, and the new CEO of Generation Citizen, a national nonprofit committed to providing youth with the knowledge and skills they need to actively participate in our democracy. Prior to joining Generation Citizen, Elizabeth was executive director of Take Root Justice, a New York City social justice organization. Elizabeth's work at Take Root built on her success as a collaborative leader, especially as chief of staff at FIPS Neighborhoods and co-director of South Bronx Rising Together, a collective impact partnership for educational equity. Elizabeth was the founding deputy director of Opportunity Nation, a national campaign to expand economic mobility. She began her career doing participatory planning in India and serving Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts as a policy advisor and the director of grassroots governance. A longtime champion of experiential learning, she serves on the board of World Learning, a leader in study abroad and development. And Elizabeth has received a BA from Columbia University and a master's in city planning from MIT. So with that, I want to welcome Elizabeth Clay Roy. Liz, we are honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Patty, and Kimberly, and everyone. You are very kind, and I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with all of you. I, wanted to enter into this conversation by sharing a little bit about how I see this moment, and sharing a little bit about how Generation Citizen aims to impact this moment. But I really do look forward to spending at least half of our time together in conversation. I feel incredibly privileged to have taken on the leadership of Generation Citizen after our co-founder, Scott Warren, who led the organization for about 12 years. I had my very first day of this role was January 4th. And I will never forget it. It's not just now going to be the year that I started, but knowing and remembering that it was just 2 days after I had started leading a democracy organization that we saw an unprecedented, certainly in the century, impact of an insurrection at Capitol Hill. And in many ways, some of what I'm going to share is, I think, talks a little bit about how we came to this moment. But my experience has been over a series of listening conversations that I've been able to have all over the country, mostly virtually, unfortunately. But that, there have been the seeds of January 6th and the seeds of our contentious election and the seeds of some of the civic chaos that many people are experiencing in elements over the last several decades. And so what I know is that the value emerges and the solutions emerge in conversation and collaboration and in joining hands to work together. And so I look forward to the spirit of that in our conversation today. So next slide, please. This is, my comments really begin with where we are at this moment. This is one of many images that could be used to inform a clear and obvious finding that our democracy is fragile. And that we are in a moment of deep challenge for our country, where the divisions that were already large seem to be getting larger. And the consequences of that seem to be going up. COVID is one quite obvious example of those consequences. The fragility of our democracy itself reduces our capacity to solve problems together. Right? That's been true for ages. And apologies if you're hearing the New York sirens behind me. But the consequences of the fragility of our democracy are compounded, right? Our technologies increase the visibility of our failures, and the magnitude of our problems, including the pandemic, really increase the gravity of the situation. But on the next slide, you'll note that broadly speaking, public trust in government has been declining for the last 60 years. So when people by and large say it seems like things are getting worse, almost no matter what your age is, that is likely to be demonstrably true. When it comes to trust. Having said that, the line is not gone directly down. We have seen high marks and low marks over the last 60 years, but moving in a downward direction, and moving, and as our society not only becomes more diverse, but as more diverse voices have an opportunity to be active in the public sphere, which wasn't true in early parts of the 20th century. Um, the deep challenges to our trust are made more visible and are put on display. And as we can communicate that to each other visibly in social media and other places, it compounds. And what's even more challenging than public trust in government having declined over the last 60 years, as you'll see on the next slide, and perhaps even more sadly, on a human level, is that 64% of American adults believe that trust in each other has also been shrinking. And, that makes it is hard enough for us to be able to solve problems together in a democracy when our trust in government declines, recognizing that government is us too. But when trust in each other, and even if that is not me saying I have less trust in someone, but it's me saying I think that other adults have less trust in each other. That makes it even harder for us to solve not just the big problems together, but the smaller problems, the problems that show up in our public squares and community spaces. And moving forward to the next slide, you'll see that younger generations are the least trusting of all three branches of government: health and criminal justice systems, and the media. And so I want this to be the first point that the conversation becomes a little more interactive. I would love if folks are willing in the chat, just note your generation and whether or not the numbers that are attributed to your generation ring true to you. Because we know that the figures we're seeing here, right, that in Generation Z, 41% have some or a lot of trust in Congress, 49% have little or none. So in a way, I actually don't want to overstate the trust deficit that's there. There is certainly one, but there are also a lot of people, perhaps including those who are interested in a topic around civic discourse, who do still have trust. But even us, and I will proudly count myself amongst one that aims to, that wakes up in the morning hoping to have greater trust than the day before and striving towards that, it makes it even harder to communicate with our peers, right? When the trust deficit, as the trust deficit grows, and appreciate folks starting to weigh in here, folks saying yes, somewhat true to a large degree, yes, and noting that trust has, in some groups within a pocket of progressive leaning POC millennials, distrust is also increasing. And so this is resonant here too. And excited when we get into the discussion portion to hear folks build on this and explore this further. But I lean us into discussion, and I'll come back to the slides in a moment. But I lean us into discussion here because I don't relate to civic engagement as an academic exercise. We are talking about how we connect as human beings who happen to be living in this democracy at this time. And the way we choose to relate to each other and the way we choose to relate to not just public institutions, but our shared processes of forming those public institutions matters quite deeply. And so I come to this always with an interest in, yes, exploring what the data tells us, what surveys tell us, but also inviting our personal perspectives and feelings into these conversations. Because the personal and political are profoundly intertwined and interdependent. And I think it's okay to name that in academic spaces too. So younger generations, least trusting of all three branches of government. So we're talking about low levels of trust, high degrees of polarization. I've not included slides today on political polarization. I think that is widely known in the levels of political polarization growing strongly over the last 40 years. And we're also talking about a rising generation, Generation Z here, but to a degree millennials too, growing up amidst periods of increasing civic chaos. And all of the data that's shared here is broadly from 2019, some of it from 2018, but it was all before March 2020, right? It was before this period of a tremendous chaos that the pandemic has thrust us into, when we find that even the most, perhaps the most emblematic of a big problem for us to solve together and to come together around, right? That the problem is not one side or another, but it's a separate third problem for us to come together and solve. The fact that we've not succeeded at doing that is also becomes a very important part of the evidence base for rising generation to inform their level of trust in society. So I personally, as I began to mention, I personally still choose hope in action, right? Many of us do. I choose to make this a moment, like activist Valerie Carr said in her speech 5 years ago. What if this darkness that we're in, this kind of period of civic darkness, is not the darkness of the tomb, but instead the darkness of a womb? Right? That we are not, in fact, called on to retreat to our private lives, even in the context of a health crisis, but to prepare our body politic to birth a new era, a new civic era. And I think that the cracks in our democracy, which now have come very close to splitting us apart, those cracks are signals of inequities from an earlier era. They're not all cracks that have been placed in the last 60 years. They have been revealed further over the last 60 years. And that we are being called to pour a foundation for the 21st century democracy that the country deserves. Right? By the middle of this century, there will be no one group, no one racial group that's in the majority. And that this demographic transition presents us an enormous opportunity and an equally enormous responsibility to put the civic infrastructure in place to build a just, inclusive, and engaged democracy that is equipped to solve big problems. Or as the next slide says it, even more beautifully, my favorite poet now, Amanda Gorman, talked about at the most recent presidential inauguration. She said, and yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. I think we know that that is part of our task, and it is a big one indeed. And the question is, if we have a task so large, and we also have such high levels of mistrust and distrust between each other and between institutions, how do we begin to take up this challenge? And so the Pew study really does highlight in the next slide one place that it might be possible for this to happen. And this just happens to be where Generation Citizen has made a big bet about 12 years ago. Public schools are, in fact, I would argue, the most universal last remaining public square standing that almost the vast majority of Americans spend some time in. And in fact, interestingly, principals of schools are amongst the most trusted leaders in society. The numbers here invite you to dig into the details further, both about the level of confidence in principals, about their level of caring and empathy, whether or not they're providing fair and accurate information to the public, whether or not they're handling resources responsibly, and looking at the data across different demographics of gender, of political orientation, of race, of age. And I'm sure we all know and can imagine instances in which it's not that people regard principals of schools as blameless. However, compared to all of the other institutions and all the other types of leaders. Principals emerge as, in fact, a trusted source of information and potentially a trusted convener around some of these difficult challenges. Now, this feels especially pertinent, right? Because to me, because as I talked about the demographic changes that are on the horizon for the entire country, well, we're already there in schools. Since 2014, the majority of America's public school students have been students of color, right? The increase in diversity that's happening for our entire country, based on the patterns of change in our country, are starting from birth and coming through our school system. And so that means schools are experiencing and shaping the demographic future of our nation. And therefore, schools are the public squares where trust can be fostered and renewed. So that affirms that what Generation Citizen has believed, that the classrooms of our public schools are the right place to practice deliberative democracy together. Students learn, contribute, and hear different perspectives and find a shared way forward. And we can meet the magnitude of this moment and recover the civic mission of schools and as anchors in our institutions at the same time. So in my next few work, but I hope that when I wrap up, we can return to conversation about the big picture and what you all see and think about these findings around the level of confidence in principals compared to other leader citizen that believes that schools are a relevant and important place to do this work. Kimberly, are you able to move to the next slide?
Is that good, Liz, or you need another one?
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, this is perfect. Thank you so much. So Generation Citizen emerged in 2008 after it was founded by a college student at the time who wanted to believe that there was a kind of civic engagement and civics education gap between his own upbringing. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Liz, we can hear you. We've turned off our cameras to help with the internet connection for everything. So hopefully this will help with that on your end too.
Okay, great. I'm so sorry. And happy to continue, but I'll maybe move through this more quickly. So what I was describing, going to the next slide, was just sharing a bit about our mission and vision. We are committed to transforming how civics education is taught by bringing the subject to life. Sometimes we describe it as driver's ed for democracy, right? We know that an important way that you learn the rules of the road is by reading the driver's manual from your local RMV or DMV. But the most important way you actually learn to drive is getting behind the wheel with appropriate support and safety measures to actually practice engaging. And so that's what our model does. We really inspire robust civic participation by inspiring their engagement around local issues and institutions and working with them to problem solve. And we have learned after over a decade of doing this, after over 100,000 students who we've worked with, that this makes a powerful difference, not only in terms of civics knowledge, civic skills, but also civics disposition and long-term engagement. And so the next few slides just describe a bit more about our approach. We call it Action Civics. It's project-based and focused on having young people learn about democracy by addressing issues in their own communities. So certainly the basics of understanding the three branches of government, for example, in our founding documents are essential, but young people can most directly connect when thinking about the issues literally in their backyard. So student-led projects on real-world personal issues that really help young people examine community, identify issues, research, strategize, take action, and reflect are at the heart of Action Civics. And as an we're an education organization. So we believe very deeply in making sure that we're scaffolding knowledge so that we're developing the strongest critical thinking skills for our young people at the same time that they are taking action on issues that matter to them. The next slide just shares a little bit more about where we are working. Really proud to say, as I talk to you all on the West Coast, that the Bay Area has been one of our sites since 2013 with some emergent partnerships in Riverside and San Diego and Central California and others coming soon in Southern California. But our work is nationwide, and that's intentional. We know that our work is deep. We work closely with teachers with ongoing teacher coaching and support for our projects. So we can't be in all 50 states at our current scale, but we wanted to make sure that we're working in a range of communities. And so the majority of students who we serve are in schools that have a high percentage of students who are on free and reduced lunch. Also have high levels of diversity. And we're working in urban schools, in rural schools, and in a few suburban schools as well that do kind of reflect this country. I saw some questions coming earlier about the current political moment around this work, and look forward to talking about that as we think about lifting up the different kinds of issues that students are raising. Core to our approach is Generation Citizen is issue neutral or issue agnostic. We provide a set of tools, which the next slide will show, that help young people identify the issue that matters to them. That's not our role as Generation Citizen, and we coach our teachers to know that it's not their role either. We want young people to lift up their own wisdom about the issues that matter to them. And this gets quite personal. We have had students, for example, in a class in New York last year, when I think this was the fall semester, after students had left school somewhat abruptly in the spring because of COVID. And a number of students talked about the fact that they and their peers were observing and learning more about issues of child abuse and domestic violence because of people being quarantined and at home. Very, very painful and challenging topics to raise, but it was raised by young people. And so the tools that we offer help them do, with some expert support, why does the problem happen, doing some root cause analysis, inviting young people to talk about their plan and the actions that they can take to make change. Sometimes students will go through that process and decide that the actions that they want to take are educational and informational. Sometimes it will be, we need to advocate to our school to offer more mental health support so that students have a safe place that they can come, or a safe person they can reach out to, even if they're remote and at home. Sometimes the solutions they recommend are more systemic. They're asking their local city council or asking the mayor to make a change. But the students lead that process, and through their this map of action civics that they go through over the course of a semester, we guide them to have the right information about how systems work so that they can learn about those systems as they seek to make change on an issue that matters to them. And then at the end, we end with a civics day where students share their learnings beyond their classroom with community leaders, with local newspaper editors, with public officials. And then they also reflect on what did they accomplish and learn. And you would not be surprised to know that many students continue work on their projects after they finish a semester with Generation Citizen, because they have become invested in making change on this issue, and often because they have felt what it's like to know that adults in their community, leaders in their community, are paying attention to them and are paying attention to the unique wisdom that they bring. Our teachers often say the moments that light them up the most over the course of of teaching Generation Citizen are not the big flashy civics day at the end where you might be at the local state house, but it is that moment where a student is running down the hallway because a staff member at a city council office called them back, or a leading expert on a particular issue was really impressed with what they had learned from those students. That spark for young people about the fact that they are already change makers in their community is such a powerful spark to ignite, and something that we're really proud of. Just go through a couple more slides left before kind of coming into open conversation. One of the journeys that our organization has been on for many years, and I'm proud to have come as we solidify our path forward on this, is a recognition that when we talk about democracy in our country, we have to make sure that we're attentive to what have been some of the challenges to our democracy in the past. And a big one has been insufficient attention to racial equity when we are committed to an inclusive democracy. And so we believe that that's something that, as we seek as an organization to strengthen democracy as well as offer young people tools that help them become change makers, that civics education itself must also be equity centered if we're to see equitable outcomes. And we define equitable civics education as being inclusive, representative, and relevant. And we've done that in a number of ways. Internally as an organization, we have undergone revisions of our curriculum to make it more inclusive of the different and varied civic traditions of all of the diverse communities in this country. We have ensured that our teacher coaching supports educators to be even better equipped to support diverse classrooms of students, to see themselves in the civic traditions in their communities, and see the strengths and name some of the challenges that have been present. And we also believe that to do this work well in our curriculum, that we must equip teachers not only to teach the Generation Citizen curriculum well and make sure that that's relevant for the moment that we're in, but that we also encourage educators to connect to local history that they may find from partnering with local libraries, local museums, and others, local community organizations. So we've increased the attention to local learning and relevance, but also that we're supporting teachers when there is a local or national crisis, that in a civics class, that they are well equipped to talk through that and help their students through that in a developmentally appropriate way. That is another way in which we think it's critical to approach civic education with attention to equity. And there's much more on our approach to this in a white paper that we published with many peers in the organization, including iCivics and Make the Challenge. And we also worked with researchers in California in the Equity in Civic Education white paper that was published in 2020, December of 2020, and would be happy to share that out after. So you can also find it on equityincivics.org to see much more about how we think about this issue, which is so central to us. We're also approaching it by seeking to support policy across the country that both increases resources and attention to civics education in schools and making sure that that's equity rooted. And the last slide that I wanted to speak to here really just brings all of this together and talks about our theory of change as an organization. We believe that with a deep investment in educators, with youth leadership, both through our organization and supporting a pipeline of youth leaders in their communities, and through robust policy and advocacy campaigns around civics education, that we are moving to achieve a just and inclusive democracy that's representative for all people and for young people in particular. So we're seeking to make change and help young people take a leading role in that. So I will close out here. As I was talking, got alerts from my neighbors that the cable and internet is out in my entire community. So I'm grateful for everyone's patience that I've been able to continue this dialogue via my cell phone. I hope that it wasn't too much of an inconvenience to pause there. So I'll stop here and eager for questions, reactions, reflections.